Good afternoon, everybody. Excuse my voice. I was raving after the jazz concert last night a little bit too hard. So I'm going to do my absolute best to have some, to carry the room a little bit. My wife is a voice teacher with me at Ohio State. She was giving me all kinds of vocal warm-ups. I didn't do any of them. So, but thank you all for coming. My name is Dr. Robert Brooks. I teach jazz saxophone at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. And today we're going to be talking about kind of my process with interfacing with jazz vocabulary. First thing, just to put out there, the word saxophone is just so it was easier for them to accept me to be able to do this. So it's a little bit more general than just jazz saxophone specifically, though the vocabulary we're going to be looking at does come from great jazz saxophonists for today. So how many, or just so I kind of know and kind of tailor what we're talking about to the room, how many of you are primarily jazz musicians? And how many of you have some jazz experience or none at all? Okay, so yeah, I would put myself in both categories. So that's good. So some of this stuff I try to find the balance of this. For those of you that are a little bit more experienced, part of this process is how I teach implementation and assimilation for jazz vocabulary. So it might be more leaning on your ability to work with students, maybe than rather than something you work on with yourself. And then for those of you that are new to this, hopefully these are actionable things you can work into your practice to kind of make progress toward being able to improvise. And a lot of times when I talk with students that are starting on this process, sound like they're playing jazz because that's a big part of what vocabulary helps us to do. So the first question, obviously we have to talk about what is jazz vocabulary. And this kind of gets us into this larger idea that I talk a lot about, which is information, sometimes say versus expression or and expression. And it's this idea that a lot of times when we're talking about improvisation, we're talking about storytelling, which is very important. We're talking about being emotive and being creative, and a lot of these musical terms that are very conceptual. And that stuff is great, and it's very, very important. I'm not here to say it's not. But the other side of communicating well is having information, is having something to say. And I always use this analogy with my students. If I tell one of my students, hey, I'm really excited for our lesson, it's gonna be great, we're gonna do this, this, and this, really excited about it, then they're gonna ask themselves when are we meeting? Because I only gave them an expressive element. I told them how I felt. And the same version, if I send somebody a really short email or I say, your lesson is Thursday at 2. Oh, are you mad about it? That's only information, right? A complete sentence, right? Something that is engaging at a holistic level has both of those. It has information and it has expression. So a lot of times our expressive tools can be more conceptual based, so it might be more of scales, it might be thinking about harmonic concepts and other things like that. And then what we're talking about today with vocabulary is the information. Your lesson is Thursday at 2. My lecture today is it Saturday? I can't keep track of the days. Saturday at 2:15, right? Things like that. So that's kind of that idea. And I alluded to this yesterday. I gave a master class talking about the foundations of jazz education. And I alluded to this idea, and the same thing that we there's hard to tell sometimes either an overused or underused saying in jazz, and some of you may have heard this, we talk about jazz as a language. And a lot of times I have experienced jazz educators who say that as if it's the end of a conversation. Well, jazz is a language, so go do that. And really it's the beginning to me. Jazz is a language, and let's get into that. And so I'm often thinking about what we're doing, assimilating this to language. So I have 4 levels when I'm thinking about speaking with somebody or thinking about constructing a sentence in any language, in English. And I have letters, words, phrases, and sentences. And for most people, you're really probably thinking in phrases. You certainly hear in phrases. When we read, we often read whole words. rarely ever are reading individual letters. And when you're listening to me speak, you're probably not thinking of the letters in the words I'm saying. You're usually getting sections of words together, and then I'm using those phrases to create sentences where I'm being expressive, hopefully, and being informative, even more hopefully. So that's kind of that idea, and we can translate that into jazz education with notes, shapes, licks, and lines. And a lot of times people start at licks, and that's difficult to do, right? Because that's level 3. And effectively, each one of these ideas is made up of the things that come beforehand. So a collection of notes becomes a shape, a collection of shapes and notes might be a lick, and a collection of notes and shapes and licks becomes a line. And again, I'll use this same joke. One of my teachers in grad school used to call that the linear thread, which would be the higher level from that. So a collection of sentences is a paragraph. So a collection of lines would be my linear thread throughout an entire chorus maybe. And so that's kind of that idea. And then the reason why we want to use vocabulary and jazz vocabulary, part of that is an authenticity aspect to your playing. You want to sound like you're playing bebop. You want to sound like you're acknowledging what the tune you're playing works with. Part of what is difficult about that is that not all language is appropriate in all situations. So we're focusing very, very, kind of zooming into bebop specifically for this. That can work in a variety of situations, but again, and my teacher teaches a lot in phrases. I teach a lot in phrases. A joke you tell is just as funny whether you tell it at a bar or you tell it at a funeral, but it might be a different reaction to the funeral, right? So it really does, the context really does matter with that kind of thing. The second thing is practicality. I don't have an unlimited amount of incredible ideas. And sometimes if I get a C level idea, maybe it's better to play a B level piece of vocabulary. And then that way I save my A level idea, and that becomes this interspersed. It's not an either or thing, right? There's very much kind of doing this. And then finally is with being able to communicate the harmony. I think that's a lot of what, especially at the beginning and particularly in bebop, that's what jazz vocabulary helps you to unlock, is being really, really particular with the vocabulary that we're kind of working through. So the first step is assessment. Oh, that's smaller than I expected it to be. Where does jazz vocabulary come from? I often point to, I think the easiest place to start assimilating jazz vocabulary, and something that I actually came to later on in my kind of my journey as an improviser and as a jazz musician, is bebop melodies. A lot of times people jump straight to transcription, which is also a good starting place, but there's a lot of information, right? It is very difficult to learn a language, where I would kind of relate that to, I'm gonna watch movies or watch TV in another language. Not a bad way to do it, certainly, but that might not be the best way to do it. So it might be easier to learn practical phrases, and that might be something that's in a melody. Pretty much anything written by Charlie Parker as a melody really is a bebop vocabulary etude. And so that can be a really great place to start. Transcription, absolutely, let's say they're tied for first place. That is also obviously an incredible thing, and I think something that certainly is true in jazz, and I think has some relevance in the classical side as well. But especially when I talk to my colleagues who focus maybe on early music or are playing instruments with a much longer lifespan and history than ours, like piano or violin, they don't have a lot of primary source. And I think the most important part about transcription is that you are learning the language from somebody who speaks that language, and they recorded themselves speaking to you. So they'll do it the same way every time, over and over, and you don't have to pay for it. And it's quite the luxury that we have. How great would it be, I'm sure, if we could have recordings of Bach playing his own music, right? That would change, frankly, it'd probably end a lot of people's careers because there would be no more speculation. We don't have a lot of speculation on how John Coltrane thought of his own music. We have volumes and volumes of what he thought about it in terms of his playing, in terms of how he's doing that. So the 3 pieces of vocabulary that I want to look through and kind of take this process through, and something that I didn't put on this because I didn't really know how to write it. All of those are really great sources, and I also put on etudes and licks collections. I kind of put those in 3rd and 4th. Etudes can be great. I think an etude is kind of like reading the written word versus hearing somebody speak it. It is a fundamentally different way that you are going to interface with that music because it has been edited. And I think that is the important part. When you read a book that is published, several people have gone through that. And it is not the way that I would speak. It's a more formal, way to kind of work through that. And so etudes are a tool that I would put as, under getting a primary speaker. So they're part of that. And then I put licks collections at the end. Something that I certainly use. I think that's honestly a really advanced tool. You have to know how to use it. In the same way that it would be difficult to learn a language from a dictionary. Just here's all the words. And if I don't know how to use that, it's effectively a useless tool for me. So that's kind of how I'm looking through it. A lot of times people, especially in modern education, I certainly have students at Ohio State, but also some of the high school students that study with me who that's what they do. Oh, I bought this PDF of 7,000 licks and I memorized lick number 412. Okay, but it doesn't mean anything for me to use it in a meaningful conversation. So the 3 patterns that we're going to look at are from certainly legendary jazz saxophonists. We're going to get into that a little bit. So the first one is from Charlie Parker, and I have recordings of them, but I can't get the sound to work, so I'm going to play these. And these have been transposed. This is originally from the 2nd chorus bridge of Confirmation. This is transposed into C major. I'm going to play it in the written pitch, just so we're on the same page with that. But just so we're clear on that. Our second pattern, also transposed, again, is from Sonny Rollins. This is from the 1st chorus of Tenor Madness. That one's slightly edited because those of you that might know that solo, he's playing into that phrase and out of that phrase. So that is very much, something that kind of is trimmed to make it a little bit more modular, because as players from bebop advanced, their playing became a lot more, or a lot less plug and play in terms of like an earlier bebop approach. So that one's a little bit edited. And then the last one is Dexter Gordon. This is from the 1st chorus of, also transposed, from the 1st chorus of his solo on Blue Bossa. There we go. So part of the assessment ability with that stage is, do I like this vocabulary? Right? That is always the first question you should always ask about any music ever. Do I like this? That's the first test. Part of that is because that is what most people do. That's as far as they get with music, is, do I like that? No. And then they click off or whatever, that's it. As musicians, we take the next question, which is why, but that should be your first question too. I picked these licks because I like them, because I think they're good. There's nothing more than that. I could have picked so many other pieces of vocabulary. So I think that's another important thing to stress. There's nothing necessarily special about these sentences, in the same way that a very complicated sentence can have a lot of meaning, but so can a very simple sentence. I think that's an important thing to think about. And the last thing for assessment, from the perspective that we're looking at, I pretty much want to have my vocabulary be functioning over a 2-5-1, or a common chord progression in general. So I have listed a major 2-5-1, and I have a 3-6-2-5-1, or a 1-6-2-5-1. It's kind of derivatives of that. I don't personally consider those as their own kinds of chord changes, though you can find more like specific language to that for sure. Then I also have a minor 2-5, tritone substitution on a 2/5, a backdoor 2/5. That's all the 2/5s that exist. And the last one is blues vocabulary, which is a difficult one. Obviously, the blues is a big part of jazz, but it is also its own vocabulary. And playing in a blues style is its own pursuit. In the same way that a lot of musics that are derivative of jazz, and not derivative, I mean, come after jazz, are a part of that continuum, maybe is a better way to say it. Also have their own vocabulary, but there is an element that we can talk about the same ideas kind of as we go. So each one of these vocabularies, pieces of vocabulary are, again, I would refer to these as licks, that level 3 idea. And as a part of the analyzing process, we're going to talk about how I might find the notes and shapes and other things there. And as part of the assimilation process, we'll figure out how we can maybe turn them into lines. But these are all over long 2/5s, right? So I just want to stress that. That is an important part of it. A lot of times I'll have people, or students or whomever, will say, oh yeah, I learned this really awesome lick, and it's over these very specific chord changes. And not that that's wrong, certainly, not that it's not something that you should work on, but it might be less practical to assimilating into your playing directly because of that. I think that's important. The next system, or the next thing to work on, is analyzing our vocabulary. So often the place that I start people with the analysis aspects is converting letter names to numbers. I try as little as I possibly can all the time to not think in letter names. It's really inefficient. I'm almost exclusively thinking in numbers. And that also sets me up to recognize shapes and some of those other things. And the first way to do that is from the key center. So I think about whatever my 1 chord in a 2/5-1 is. For all of our licks today, it's C major. And I'm just converting that C, D, E, F, G to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I'm doing an analysis, and it kind of looks messy. I try to figure out a better way to do this. Partly because there's triplets in this first one, so you have to ignore that first 3. This is a lot of information, right? In the same way that if I'm reading something, or maybe I'm reading a language I'm not totally fluent in yet, I'm reading letters. It's a lot of, I'm sounding it out, I'm figuring it out. Hard to focus on the meaning when I'm focused on more fundamental things like pronunciation or other things with that language analysis. So that's what this looks like. What this helps to do is it helps to see where you are in that larger context in C major. It also helps you to be able to see repetition with notes, see other shapes, things like that. And I can do the same thing for these other 2 patterns. And a lot of times I have students that start at this point, and it makes the most sense to them because part of what they might be working on is playing a scale. And that helps them to put it in harmonic context. Maybe it's easier for them to figure out a starting note, things like that. This can be a good way to do it. This isn't my favorite way to do it personally, but that's our first step. And truly all I'm doing is I'm converting that 1 chord and then moving through each one of these phrases that way. The next step is probably fairly predictable. It's the same thing, just from the chord in that measure. And this is the one that I think makes the most sense because it helps you to see repetition between chords, and also think a little bit more specifically to kind of what we're doing. So this first pattern is, I'm able to start seeing some of these structures, start seeing parts of chords, scale fragments, repetition that might exist. And then also, a big part of and I said repetition, a big part of creating melodicism in jazz is having that repetition. And so I can start to see how often I'm playing the 5th of a chord, how often I'm playing the 3rd, things like that. And that's always the big thing. When I started transcribing solos, especially with Dexter Gordon, who's certainly my favorite tenor player. I'm normally a tenor player. And what I noticed with him is like, oh man, everything he's playing, it's fairly obvious. There's nothing here that's blowing my mind in terms of like, how do they come up with that, right? But it was a lot of it sounds authentic, and it was a lot of the how he's saying rather than the what he's saying in that instance. But this system kind of helps you to do that. So I can go through these other ones, and I start to see, and this is kind of unlocking this idea with starting to see shapes in some of these other ways that we can kind of work through stuff. And like I said, so on these slides, of course, everything in C major was the same as the last slide, but each chord, I'm resetting that number system to being more focused on the mode in that measure. Okay. And the last one is identifying shapes. So shapes can be a lot of different things. And like I said, in the analogy I used before with language, these are words. So they're not the lowest level in our language, but they're one level more simplistic. They can be scale fragments, they can be scale patterns. Enclosures is another shape that I think that helps people unlock either diatonic or chromatic enclosures, kind of unlock a more of a jazz sound, a more of a modern approach to that. And an enclosure, is chromatic enclosure certainly is one that's really, really common. And then finally are these jazz shapes, these specific jazz words. And these are, sometimes people call these digital patterns. And this is something that I most readily associate with somebody like John Coltrane, but kind of in that era. There were certainly players that was starting and a lot of players that have gone on in that legacy. So some of the more simple jazz shapes, 1, 2, 3, 5. Right, I'm starting all of those with that shape. Right. Another one that I have down that is also really common, and I think I actually played it in one of those other patterns, is that inversion 7, 1, 2, 3, 5. Things like that have that shape inside of it. And I think a lot of times if you're earlier on in this process, you have a hard time hearing those individual words. In the same way that all of you hopefully are understanding the words that I'm talking about immediately because we're fluent in that language. And if I speak a different language, I would be just as clear, but I didn't get any of those, right? So I'm not able to kind of understand what's going on that way. And then that last one is 3, 5, 1, 7. Ooh, excuse me. So I'm thinking through that pattern. That's another really common shape. And so when I'm learning new patterns or I'm teaching new patterns, I'm more focused on being able to identify these shapes. I want to know what the words are in a sentence, effectively what's going on. So we'll kind of go through this a little bit. These are some of the shapes. This is very much a more personal thing. I think part of what is good about the number system is it's very literal, but it is a lot of information, right? Especially on some of these long 2/5 patterns. It's just a lot of notes, it's a lot of numbers to remember. And so much easier to break this down into like 4 or 5 pieces of information rather than, all eighth notes would be 16 or more individual pieces of information. So that first shape is a scale pattern that's mirrored. Right? I'm hearing that as just a fragment of the scale starting on the 1. The shape B is an upper structure triad. It's really, really common. Fully diminished 7th chord starting from the 3rd. And then followed by a scale. So C was that another scale fragment, not mirrored or anything like that, just in I don't know, not root position, but normal. And then I get shape D is a diatonic enclosure. C being my target note. And then shape E is a descending arpeggio. And there are other notes that are a part of this, but like we talked about earlier, I'm kind of doing the analysis with this as a combination of shapes and notes. So I think to myself, starts on 5, then I play shape A, repeat 5, go to 1, and then 3, 5. So now hopefully when you're hearing this, I'm starting to think in these larger shapes. Rather than just a series of notes. We can do the same thing with the Sonny Rollins pattern. Shape A is actually a common jazz shape. This is actually a pattern that pops up a lot. I learned that shape actually from transcribing Cannonball Adderley. He plays that shape a lot. And I can't remember what solo. It's like the minority solo or something. He plays in like the same measure every chorus. And it sounds great every single time. But that's one of those shapes. So I could consider that to be like a jazz shape. Then B is a very simple diatonic enclosure. That F natural on the downbeat of the 5 chord at the beginning of shape C. This is actually interesting. This is a displaced version of 1, 2, 3, 5. So if I put the first note, that F, in the lower octave at the end, that's where that shape's coming from. So that, to me, and this is kind of the rabbit hole, there's so many ways to, so many permutations you could have of any of these shapes. It can be hard to do that. In the same way that I might change tense in a language, you still be able to recognize that it's the same word. But that's what that shape is. So that is a derivative of that 1, 2, 3, 5 pattern. It's an augmented triad, but something that I can identify and analyze in that idea. So that's the Sonny Rollins pattern. That one is all shapes, and then the last note I think of as 9. And that's that combination. And the last one is Dexter Gordon pattern. Shape A is just the Dorian scale from the root. Very simple, right? That's not mind-blowing. It's clear. It's very important. That's a part of communicating well. That's chromatic, mirrored, again, kind of like the beginning of the Charlie Parker line. That is an expansion of the 7-1-3-5 shape. I play it backwards. That's that pattern. And then I end with descending major thirds. All right. That's that idea. So that one as well is exclusively shapes. And that takes this, the Dexter Gordon line particularly goes into 4 measures worth of music, depending on how you're thinking about that. And I'm able to turn it into 4, simple pieces of information that I can start to manipulate, but I can hopefully remember easier in terms of what we're working through. So the final thing to talk about is assimilating what we're doing. And I think this is probably the hardest part for a lot of people, in the same way that I have taken many language classes and have tried fairly diligently to learn other languages. And it's very different, to be able to read something, to then go to that country and not have people, I say, one sentence in German or something, and someone will respond to me in English and go, we're not even gonna try that. And that's kind of that idea. So the assimilation process certainly is the most time consuming, because it is the most directly practical in what we're doing. So assimilating shapes. I think is kind of the beginning of this. I want to learn a series of words and then I can put them into their functional context. So I use 4 processes for that. And each one of these has a purpose. So those 4 processes are up by perfect fourth, down by half step, down by whole step, and up by minor third. Each one of these are based on like a harmonic device that we use in jazz. Of course, up by perfect fourth is just the cycle. That's not anything too shocking. But that's also a 2-5. I think about a 2-5 in C major is a D root to G root to C root. So being able to play that from there goes a long way. And of course, I'm working through this in all 12 keys for any one of those shapes that we did before. And I'm working through that, and I joke about this, I'm very honest with my students about it. The other 3 processes are just as much about their harmonic implication as it is just fooling my students to practice it 4 times as much as they would have otherwise, right? Because it's very easy to go, oh, I can play this. Oh, I know how this works, you know, and then what's the next thing? And it needs to be your subconscious. You need to have fluency in what we're doing, not just functionality. So down by half step is indicative of a tritone step, right? So when I think about taking those chords I had before, D minor 7 to G7, and I put a tritone step on that dominant chord, it becomes D flat dominant. And so I'm able to move through those shapes down by half step. I think goes a long way. Down by whole step is another one that kind of gives us a lot of alterations. I think about taking this shape and moving it down by whole steps, and I had a backing track to put this in harmonic context. I think it's important. But I might do something as simple, again, I'm staying in C major. Where I'm moving that pattern down by whole steps, and I start inside of the key. I played that 1, 2, 3, 5 shape in G, and then in F. Those would all be diatonic notes of C major. Then I played it in E flat, less diatonic. Then I played it in D flat, very much not diatonic. It's the least diatonic of those. And so I start inside, I have some tension, and then I go through it, and maybe that's a sentence I'm confronting somebody with some damning information. I saw where you were last night, or whatever it was, right? And then the last one is up by minor third. I think this one is really, really common for other pieces, other of those jazz shapes. I think about one that at least I hear a lot, and maybe again because I practice it, is that 7-1-3-5 pattern going up in minor thirds. Right, because that gives me something that's inside and then something that's altered. I think the most iconic version of that process is the Crimea River lick. Where I'm able to put that through 3 different minor thirds, and each time I get farther away from the key, but because that shape is very strong and very melodic, I resolve each time. And so that's kind of where those 4 processes are. There are plenty of other ways to practice this. I'm certainly not telling you not to practice them up by half step or something like that. But as a starting point, as kind of what I talk about with my students, with a minimum, this is what I want you to be able to do. You come in a lesson, here's the shape. You got to be able to do all of these, without any kind of hesitation or doubt. And then you can do other things. Other shapes also have specific things. Something that I do really often is snake patterns. Right, where I'm going up and down, but I'm going down by a half step. So that's something that's a little bit more specific. That doesn't work as well on other shapes, but that's kind of that idea. And then the next assimilation process from that is the larger lick patterns. And so I'm thinking about learning these patterns, certainly in common keys. I don't ever talk about hard or easy, right, by a long shot. With my students, I don't want to admit defeat, but it's very much is common keys versus 12 keys, which I think is important. Common keys are always easier keys. And there is an element, I think this is important to at least acknowledge, there is an element of practicality in your practice, right? I'm just gonna play an F more than I'm gonna play in C sharp. Doesn't mean you don't wanna learn stuff in C sharp, but there might be an element to strategizing your practice to have a little bit more emphasis on common keys because of that. That's all I'll say on that. I certainly would encourage you to learn things in 12. Again, if for no other reason, it's just more repetition. It's just getting it into your mind at a deeper and deeper level. And then we're gonna start into the assimilation process in terms of specific things that you can practice. I put tunes on here, and I'm not sure what that means. 4 processes is the same processes from before. So I might play through patterns through the cycle, through these licks, through the cycle, through down by half set, through down by whole set, just as different ways to kind of interface with the information as much as possible. And so finally we have the application of this. And I had tracks and stuff set up, so we'll kind of skip over that, but I think I'm going long on time. So of course, playing is with a metronome is important. The key element, we're talking a lot about harmony. The identifying element of jazz is the rhythm. I think that's really, really important. We talk about harmony all the time. Often that is a focus, so that's what a lot of people focus on. It is the rhythm that sets our music apart, I think, more than any other thing. There's improvisation in other kinds of music. The chords and the scales we use exist. The instruments certainly exist in other kinds of music. The rhythm doesn't. The rhythm is unique. And I think that's really, really important to kind of acknowledge. So the first thing to focus on after you're able to understand the shapes and these patterns, whatever you're working on, is playing with the metronome, particularly metronome played on 2 and 4. That's kind of, to me, the starting point, and then I might even reduce my clicks from there. And then of course playing this with a backing track, and I was gonna kind of do some demo of that. Because after I'm able to put it in a rhythmic context, I wanna put it in a harmonic context, because that enables me to know, oh, when I say this, I get a reaction. And I might not know that this joke is funny until someone laughs at it, kind of thing. Or I might not know that's a mean or an offensive thing to say until somebody gets pissed off at me. And so I want to be able to kind of understand where that goes. One of the things I do with the backing track that I work with my students a lot is what I call a setup or an escape. So a setup is improvising into a line. I think that's a really, really important part of the assimilation process. After all of the repetition, and oh my God, I've played this pattern so many times, then I need to be able to weave that vocabulary word seamlessly into a sentence. And so practicing that as an abstract concept, I think is really, really important. And so that's what I call setup. And then the escape is the same thing. That might be altering the vocabulary. So that might give me something where I'm gonna say, well, I'm gonna improvise something instead of shape A, or instead of A and B. So I'm really gonna use this fragment. Oh, and I'm gonna use this other fragment. Or maybe I'm gonna swap this shape out for something else because it facilitates my voice leading a little bit better. Or an escape might be the same thing, where I get to a certain point and then I go in a different direction, right? Or I just continue the line. I think about in the original version of that Sonny Rollins pattern, he plays, man, I'm trying to remember. He kind of continues that line on with another shape. And so here's part of that is because he's outlining other changes. I don't think it actually goes to one chord there. But I think that's kind of an important thing to think about with those two concepts. That's something that sometimes I do, especially with my younger students in the studio. In a lesson, we'll just go back and forth and effectively see how far away can you get from this lick while I still know it's that lick, right? And a lot of times I call that an inside joke. It's like you get something so processed with your group of friends. Oh, I just have this little snippet, one word, and everyone knows the story that I'm thinking of, right? And so I'm able to understand what you have to say without it having to be super obvious every time. One more step up from there. So to me, each one of these for the application points are getting more and more complicated. So we have our metronome, right? And then we're adding harmonic context with time, that's a backing track. Then we're starting to alter the vocabulary, that's the setup and the escape. Now we have what I call fixed points. So I might take a tune that I'm working on, like There Will Never Be Another You, which is the track I have. And I might designate on those 2/5s to play certain vocabulary, and then I'm improvising around that. And a lot of times that's what I think about, and I kind of use this analogy when I teach a lot. That's what I'm doing now, right? I'm not reading a script, but I have an idea of what we're talking about, right? And I'm using my knowledge, and we're kind of using my expertise both in the subject matter and also hopefully in the English language to come up with something that is engaging, right? And I, trying to figure things out. So it's not something as restricted as I've written everything out, but I have key points that I have to get to. And that's kind of what the fixed points idea is. And so a lot of times what that looks like is prioritizing the vocabulary and its placement, and then I'm improvising in or out of that. Sometimes that starts with I just don't play at all. Sometimes that's, I think about a tune like There'll Never Be Another You. The first major 2/5 I get is measure 7 and 8 going to the 4 chord. Sometimes I just have students who just sit there and count. 1, 2, 3. Okay, it's counting. What note is it starting again? Oh man, here it comes, here it comes. And I'll count them in sometimes and they're able to put it in, right? I think that's certainly can be a part of that process, and it can ratchet all the way up to I have certain licks that I put, and it could be a variety of licks, it doesn't have to be the same one. And then the most extreme controlled example of that is writing an etude that uses certain things. And this is something that I do in our improv class that I teach. I teach the upper level courses for jazz improvisation at Ohio State. And particularly in Improv 2, I have students have to, as a part of this process, have to write etudes on all the tunes. And then the final project is they talk about that, and then everybody exchanges etudes. So then you get, tons and tons of choruses with vocabulary that you haven't worked on, and all of this stuff that class is being taught now, so it's going into spring. And then you have all summer to be like, cool, I have, 12 fundamentally different choruses on this one tune that I can practice and work on, and oh, that's really interesting. Oh, let me do some analysis and understand that in a very different way than transcribing would kind of benefit you. So each one of those levels of application or assimilation is kind of getting more and more complicated, and that's kind of why we're in that order with the metronome, backing track, elaborating on what we're doing, fixing, the fixed points idea, having specific places that I want to put in the vocabulary, and then if it's kind of like an optional thing, then writing out a chorus to be able to ensure that I'm doing that. And that also kind of speaks to something that I think is important with improvisation. It was really, I view it on the same spectrum or the same continuum as composition. Right? The only difference between improvising something and composing something is your ability to edit it later. Right? As soon as I play, it's out there. But I have all the same tools, I'm thinking the same way. And so effectively what writing an etude does is releases you from the ability to edit. So I might have, if you're someone that's struggling with some of those concepts, I have 2 minutes to sit there. What's the third of A flat dominant? When in the moment it's gone already. Right, but in that instance, I might be able to be very, very specific with what I'm doing. And so that's kind of the idea in terms of teaching this, certainly, but that also might be things that you can put in your own practice. And of course, this system works with any vocabulary. So as something gets more and more complicated, and I'm working on stuff that's maybe post-bop, or maybe vocabulary that come out of more modern jazz. So I might be transcribing players that are alive today. These processes still work, but just that there's a lot of, those shapes are more complicated. The harmony that we're using are more complicated. Often they're longer and things like that. And that's kind of why we start at the bebop level. So that's all the stuff I have for today. I think we're pretty close to right on time. This didn't advance, sorry. There we go. Excuse me. This QR code not only has all the slides that I presented today, has some of my contact information, and finally it has some materials that I use in the Jazz Saxophone Studio class. Every week, all of my students in studio learn a piece of vocabulary in all 12 keys, and then we kind of just randomly pick people, and then you have to play it. So I call on somebody and I go, play this in B, and stuff like that. Not because I expect all of them to be doing this entire process with all of that, not because I want them to all constantly be playing patterns and nothing else. But really just to give them something to go, right? It's a lot of information, right? How do I pick? Let me take that away from you. This is what you do. And I absolutely have some sort of like, yeah, I didn't practice much this week. I don't like this week's lick. Okay? You just gotta, you know, take your risks on if I'm gonna call it in G major, if I'm gonna call it in B major, right? And then other patterns, some of my students are like, yeah, this one's awesome, and they really get into it, and that's more about that. But all of the licks for everything that we did this school year, those PDFs are also there, and that can be something that you kind of work in your own practice or look through and kind of pick and choose. But all that stuff's there. Love to get any questions if there are any questions. But that's all for today. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it. Anything I can answer? Kind of with the last few minutes, yeah.
Near the beginning, you mentioned like Charlie Parker melodies to kind of go and transcribe. Are there any like particular ones that you would really recommend?
The one that comes to mind right away is Donnelly. I think that is, if not exclusively like Parker licks, then it's mostly Parker licks, right? It's hard to say, you know, ornithology certainly would be one of those. Anthropology has a lot of that vocabulary and stuff in it. Really anything that he plays at a medium or faster tempo would kind of fit in for that. And that's a really good place to start. Also, as you advance, something that I worked on in grad school quite a bit was then playing all those melodies in the altissimo range to kind of start to assimilate some of that stuff there. So if you're more advanced or if you already know that stuff, that can be something to kind of work through, is playing those melodies in that extreme range. Any other questions? Also available if you want to come up. That's totally fine too if you don't want to ask in front of me, but anything else I can answer that comes to mind? Okay, cool. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate it. I'll leave this up. If you're interested in connecting with me at all or those materials, please feel free. And if you have a question, I'm more than happy to kind of answer that up here. But thank you again for coming. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of the conference.